She didn't ask his name, didn't ask what happened to him, didn't even ask why he was sleeping behind her barn. She just brought him a bowl of stew and left the barn door open. No cameras, no expectations. Just one act of quiet kindness on a cold North Carolina night. What she didn't know was that the man she helped used to command hundreds, and that months later Black Hawk helicopters would land on her field to return the favor. This isn't a story about charity. It's a story about mercy and what happens when one open door leads to something far greater. Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. The wind came early that year. It swept across the hills of Ashe County, North Carolina, stirring the trees like ghosts that had waited all summer to speak. The mornings turned sharp and the air carried a scent of brittle leaves and wood smoke. Out on the edge of a sloping field, a woman stood alone watching her bees fight the cold. Grace Dalton, 42, had learned to read the seasons by sound. The rustle of dying leaves meant frost would come before dawn. The soft whine of wind through the cedar trees meant the hives needed wrapping. And the silence, thick, unmoving absolute, meant winter was coming faster than anyone wanted to admit. She sipped her coffee from a chipped blue mug, her boots planted in the soft, muddy edge of her apiary. The sun hadn't climbed over the ridge yet, but the sky had already begun to pale. She could see the frost hugging the metal lids of the hives, the sluggish bees barely moving now. "Come on, girl," she murmured. "Just hold on a little longer." The bees didn't answer. They never did. Grace owned 12 hives, one rusted truck, and exactly $34 in her checking account. Her husband Michael had built the barn with his bare hands 12 years ago, back when they still believed this land could save them. He'd been a combat engineer in the Gulf War. Came back with damaged lungs and a fierce love for things that buzzed. Bees, Grace always thought, were a perfect reflection of him. Quiet, purposeful, relentless. Michael passed away 4 winters ago. Lung cancer. It moved faster than either of them could track. When he died, he left her the land, the hives, and a pile of unpaid medical bills big enough to choke a bank manager. She kept going anyway, not because she believed in miracles, but because there was nothing else to do. That night, Grace lit the last stick of oak in her wood stove and sat at the kitchen table rubbing at her knees. Cold settled deep in her bones now. She didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. The bills were spread out in front of her like a quiet threat. Electricity feed veterinary clinic. Notice mortgage overdue by 74 days. She rubbed her temples and closed her eyes. Just get through the week. Then came the noise. It wasn't loud, just a thump, like wood shifting against wood. Grace's eyes opened slowly. Another sound, a creak. She grabbed the flashlight from the hook near the door and stepped outside. The wind slapped her face the moment she opened it. Cold, bitter, full of pine and silence. Her boots crunched over frozen grass as she made her way to the barn. She kept the flashlight low, scanning for movement. Raccoons, maybe a fox. But when she reached the side of the building and angled the beam up, her breath caught. Someone was curled up against the back wall, wrapped in a worn army jacket, hood-up backpack beside him. His shoulders were shivering but not moving much. "Hey!" She called louder than she meant to. "This is private property." The figure stirred. Grace's grip tightened on the flashlight. "You hear me?" He turned slowly. The hood fell back just enough for her to see his face, weathered, dark-bearded, hollow-eyed. "I'm not here to steal," he rasped. "Just needed somewhere out of the wind." Her heart thumped. "Who are you?" Hesitated, then looked down. "Name's Samuel. Dean." There was a pause. His voice sounded like it hadn't been used in days. Grace looked him over. Boots caked in mud. Left knee stiff, eyes sharp but tired. Deep lines carved into his cheeks. There was something familiar in the way he sat, half alert, half surrendered. "You a vet?" she asked cautiously. He nodded once. "Marines." "How long you been out here?" "Few days, just passing through." Grace considered calling the sheriff. It would have been the logical thing, but the way he sat like a man who'd already been judged 100 times stopped her. "You hungry?" she asked, surprising herself. Samuel didn't answer right away. Then slowly he nodded. "Get inside, you can warm up by the stove." He didn't speak much as he ate. Grace gave him the leftover stew she'd made 2 nights ago, with half a biscuit and a slice of cheddar. He sat at the edge of the table, barely making a sound, eating slowly, carefully, the way people eat when they aren't sure when the next meal will come. She watched him in silence. His jacket was Marine Corps issue faded. His hands were callous, scarred across the knuckles. His left ring finger was gone. "You on the road long?" she asked. "A while? Where you headed?" He shrugged. "West, maybe. Depends what I find." She didn't press. The fire crackled quietly between them. After a while, she stood and pulled a folded blanket from the couch. "You can sleep in the barn," she said. "It's not warm, but it's dry." He looked at her like she'd just handed him something sacred. "I don't want to trouble you," he murmured. "You already did," she said bluntly, "but I'm choosing not to mind." She woke early before the sun as always. The barn was quiet. She peeked inside. He was gone. Blanket folded, empty mug near the hay bales. A piece of cardboard on the workbench with 4 words scrawled in thick marker. "There are still good people," and beneath that, just his name. S.D. The days passed. Grace didn't expect to see him again. Men like that, they drift, they never linger. But something about that encounter lingered with her. She'd seen those eyes before, in Michael, in the mirror. The week wore on with silence and setbacks. 2 hives collapsed in the frost. The farm co-op canceled their winter order. Her truck wouldn't start. Then came the letter, unmarked envelope, no return address. Inside a single sheet of paper folded once, no signature. "I've been in darker places than I care to name. But that night in your barn, something shifted. Thank you for seeing me when I didn't want to be seen." No name, no address, but she knew the next day. Grace stood at the edge of her field, the wind whispering past the frost-covered grass. She stared at the old barn, its boards cracked roof sagging. She touched the folded letter in her coat pocket. No one else knew. Not the bank, not the co-op, not the neighbors who hadn't knocked in weeks, but she knew something had changed, not in the world, but in her. The days blurred after the letter. Grace kept the paper folded tight in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest, like a heartbeat. She didn't want to forget. She didn't tell anyone, not the feed store clerk, not the loan officer who left another message about resolution options, not even the old woman at the post office who'd known her since high school. Some things weren't meant for sharing. They were meant for carrying. The weather turned sharper in early November. One morning, Grace stepped out to find the barn door slightly ajar. At first, her heart jumped, then settled. Wind maybe, or the latch just worn loose. She walked across the frost-laced yard, boots crunching with each step. When she pushed the door open, everything looked the same, except for one thing. A small wooden box sat on the old workbench, carefully sanded, polished. Rough edges, smoothed by hand. The lid had a tiny brass clasp and etched faintly into the side in blocky letters. For G. She stared at it for a long time before touching it. Her fingers hesitated on the lid, then lifted it open. Inside was a metal. Bronze weathered, shaped like a shield. A Marine Corps commendation old enough that its edges had dulled with time. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a note. "This sat in my pack for 10 years. Thought I'd bury the man who earned it. Turns out he just needed a night in your barn. S." Grace sat down hard on the bench. The cold of the woods seeped into her bones. She held the metal in both hands, unsure what to do with it. It felt heavier than it should have been. She kept the metal tucked inside the drawer where Michael's old beekeeping tools lived. She didn't tell anyone, but each morning after, when she opened the barn, she'd glance at that box, half hoping, half dreading, to see something else. Nothing came, not for a while. Thanksgiving passed without company. Grace made a pot of cornbread, dressing more out of habit than celebration. The phone rang once, her cousin from Tennessee, but she didn't answer. She didn't feel like lying about how things were going. The truth was they weren't. 2 of her best clients backed out due to uncertain economic factors. A pipe burst under the house, and a final notice came in red ink across a letterhead she'd hoped to never see again. Final demand, foreclosure in 30 days. She read it once, then again, and set it face down on the kitchen counter. There was no one coming to save her. One evening in early December, she sat on the porch with a cup of weak coffee and a flannel blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long ribbons of gold across the frozen grass. A flock of geese passed overhead, their calls trailing behind them like string, and that's when she heard the truck. It was distant at first, then closer, gravel popping under its tires as it approached from the far end of her long, sloped driveway. Not many people drove up that way, especially not after dark. She stood slowly, heart tightening. The truck was black, old military style, not government issued, not anymore. It stopped 20 feet from her porch. A man stepped out. Grace froze, same eyes, same quiet stance, same jacket, Samuel Dean. But something was different now. His beard was trimmed, his shoulders less slumped. He walked with a purpose, not the aimless drift of a man looking for shelter, but the slow, certain stride of someone who had found something worth returning for. She met him halfway between the porch and the truck. He tipped his head slightly. Evening. I thought you were passing through, she said. I was. He answered, then I wasn't. She nodded toward the driveway. Didn't expect to see you again. Didn't expect to come back. He paused, but I needed to. They stood in silence a moment. The wind tugged gently at his jacket. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Held it out. Grace hesitated, then took it. The letterhead was strange, clean, professional. At the top, in bold, Veteran Agricultural Rehabilitation Initiative. She looked up. I've been working with a new team, he said, advising on recovery through trade programs, farming, forestry, apiary work. They're looking to partner with landowners. One's willing to offer space and a little trust. Grace raised an eyebrow. You think that's me? Samuel smiled faintly. I know it is. She looked back at the paper. The initiative wanted to lease land from smallholder farms to host veteran-run apiary training programs. They'd cover expenses, supply equipment, provide a stipend to the host. No strings attached. I told them about you, he added softly, about the barn, about the way you didn't ask anything. Grace lowered the paper. Why me? He looked at her for a long time before answering. Because kindness like that, it's not common. And because this place, it felt like something could grow here again. She folded the paper. Her fingers trembled. Samuel, she said quietly, I'm 30 days from losing everything. I can't even fix my barn roof. How am I supposed to host anything? He reached into the truck and pulled out another envelope. This one thick, sealed with a stamp she didn't recognize. Let me help, he said. They sat at the kitchen table, just like they had that first night. But now the air between them felt different. Still quiet, still careful, but warmer. Grace opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents, a letter of commitment from the initiative, a check first of 3 installments, a personal letter handwritten in looping cursive. Ms. Dalton, we've heard what you did for one of our own, and we believe in building things where kindness is planted. Consider this, your land's second chance. Sincerely, Veterans Rebuild Foundation. Grace didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, she looked at Samuel. You did all this. He shook his head. No, you did when you opened that barn door. 3 days later, trucks arrived, not government vehicles, just plain white contractors, but each one driven by someone in uniform. Men and women who moved with the quiet precision of soldiers, now builders, now framers. They went to work without much talk, reinforced the barn, fixed the well pump, installed power lines to the apiary. One of them, an older man with a limp and a silver ring on his pinky, knelt beside Grace's favorite hive and whispered, It's been 20 years since I've worked bees. Didn't know I missed it till now. She just nodded. At night, the property glowed, not with electricity, but with life. Someone started a fire pit behind the barn. Another made coffee strong enough to wake the hills. Grace brought out mason jars of last year's honey and watched strangers sit close around a flame, like brothers. Long separated, Samuel stood near the edge of it all, hands in his pockets. She walked over. They're not just fixing my barn, are they? She asked. He shook his head. No, they're fixing themselves this. He gestured to the lights, the laughter, the smell of smoke and cold air. This is what coming home is supposed to feel like. Grace didn't reply. She just stood beside him and let the warmth from the fire wrap around them both. On the 4th morning, Samuel found her near the fence line, watching the frost melt from the grass tips. He handed her a small object, heavy, cool to the touch. She turned it over. A coin, circular metal engraved on one side with the emblem of the Marine Corps. On the other, shelter given, hope rebuilt. Her throat tightened. Samuel spoke softly. We give these to civilians who remind us what we fought for. Most folks don't get one. Grace stared at it, then whispered, I'm not sure I deserve this. That's why you do, he replied. The work didn't stop with the barn. What began as a repair effort quietly turned into something else, something larger, something steady. The kind of movement you don't notice until it's already grown roots under your feet. Within 2 weeks, Grace's property had changed. The sagging roof was now strong timber. The rotted fence posts had been replaced with fresh cedar, lined tight with new wire. Inside the barn, Rows of newly painted hive stands weighted 20 in all, enough for a full apiary training program. The land had never looked this clean or this hopeful, but it wasn't just about lumber and wire and bees. There was a pulse here now. People kept showing up, veterans from the area, from other states, even. Word had spread through whatever quiet channels people like Samuel used. Some drove in from as far as Pennsylvania. Others came by bus, duffel bags in hand, boots worn thin. They weren't loud about it, they just came. And Grace, who had once thought she'd finish her days alone on this land, now brewed 2 pots of coffee every morning and kept extra chairs by the fire pit. One afternoon, as she hauled a bag of feed toward the goat pen, she saw a man standing at the edge of her property. Mid-50s, tall, stiff posture that said military long before his jacket confirmed it. He watched the barn for a long moment before stepping forward. "Excuse me," he called gently. "Is this the Dalton farm?" Grace nodded, wiping her hands on her jeans. "It is you, here for Sam." "No, ma'am, I'm here for you." He handed her an envelope. It was thick, official, marked with the insignia of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Grace swallowed. She stepped back onto the porch to read it. Inside, a formal letter of commendation, a funding offer, and something that made her knees go weak. Designation of Dalton Farm as a regional site for veteran agricultural rehabilitation program. Samuel appeared beside her. He didn't say anything, just watched her face. "You didn't tell me," she whispered. "You wouldn't have believed me if I had." Her eyes scanned the document again. "They want to make this a permanent site." "They do. You built something here, Grace. Something real." "I didn't build this." Samuel looked at her gently. "You opened the door." "That's all it ever takes." The next day came the helicopters, 2 Black Hawk's blades, sweeping the treetops like thunder. They landed not 20 yards from the east field, sending straw and dry leaves swirling like a golden storm. Grace shielded her eyes as men in uniform stepped out. Not in combat gear, but in crisp dress blues, insignias shining in the sun. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, introduced himself as Colonel Morgan, Director of Eastern Veteran Operations. He shook Grace's hand firmly. "We're here today because a soldier once told us about a woman with nothing left to give." "Who gave anyway?" Grace didn't know what to say. Samuel stood just behind the colonel, quiet, watching. A photographer snapped a photo of the handshake. Someone in a suit handed her a folder. Reporters 2 or 3 from local papers scribbled notes from behind the tree line. Grace wasn't sure what felt stranger, the sound of helicopters landing in her hayfield or hearing her name spoken in a military citation. Later that afternoon, after the speeches, after the applause, after everyone had shaken her hand like she was something more than just a stubborn woman with a barn, she found herself back at the fence line. Samuel joined her there, like he always did. "Well," he said, "you've officially gone viral in the veteran community." She gave him a sideways look. "They make stickers for that." He smiled. "You okay?" he asked after a pause. Grace nodded slowly. "Just trying to catch up. This wasn't what I planned." "It rarely is," he said. "But that doesn't mean it isn't right." That night, after the last truck rolled away and the Blackhawks disappeared beyond the ridge, Grace stood alone in the barn. The light was low. The new hives gleamed under the soft glow of hanging bulbs. The air smelled of cedar and beeswax and fresh paint. She ran her fingers along the edge of the nearest hive box. Then she noticed something on the center workbench, a folder of plain manila with her name written in small black letters across the front, inside a handwritten note. "Grace, you saved my life before I knew it needed saving. I'd given up not just on people, but on my own worth. That night you opened the barn, I hadn't spoken to another human in 6 days. I hadn't slept indoors in over a month. I didn't think I deserved a second chance. But your silence that night, the way you didn't ask, didn't question, it changed everything. You reminded me that there's still room in this world for quiet mercy. I'm going to keep building now. And it started with you. Thank you, S." She stood there a long time after reading. Then, without realizing it, she folded the letter gently and slipped it into her coat pocket, right beside the first one. The following week, the program began in full. 10 veterans arrived, then 12, then 16. They built hives, cleaned fencing, learned to handle bees with steady hands and quiet breath. Some had never farmed a day in their life. Others had grown up in it, then left for war, and never thought they'd come back to the soil. Grace watched as they opened up, not fast, but real. One morning, a young man named Kyle, barely 30, eyes always cast down, sat beside her after the morning session and said softly, "Ma'am, I haven't slept this well since Iraq." She smiled. "It's the bees, they don't judge." He laughed, the sound scratchy from disuse. One evening, Samuel didn't show up for dinner. He wasn't in the barn, wasn't out in the fields. Grace checked the gravel road, the tool shed, even the old hayloft. Nothing. Worry crept in, slow and cold. She waited an hour, then two. Just as she reached for her coat to start walking toward the woods, she heard footsteps. He appeared on the porch, windblown and muddy, but smiling faintly. "Sorry," he said. "Took a drive. You all right?" He paused, then nodded. "I am now." She studied him. Something happened. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded photo. It was old worn, a snapshot of 5 men in desert gear, arms around each other. One of them, the one in the center, was Samuel Younger, smiling. "They're all gone," he said quietly. "All but me." Grace didn't speak. He looked up. "I visited their families today. Told them what we're building here. Told them it's because of their sons that I'm still standing." Tears didn't fall, but his voice cracked just once, and that was more than enough. Grace reached over and took his hand. They sat on the steps as the stars came out, silent together in a way that only grief and gratitude can teach. 2 days later, another envelope arrived, this one from the Veterans Agricultural Council. Inside, approval for Phase 2, grant extension, new equipment, a mobile classroom trailer. And at the bottom of the letter, the Dalton model is being considered as a template for national expansion. Grace blinked. The Dalton model. It sounded like a product, like something engineered. Not a barn, not a cup of stew, not a night of mercy that no one ever expected to matter. But she understood. It was never about structure. It was about what that structure held. People, healing, hope. That night before bed, Grace walked the property one last time. The fields were quiet. The barn stood tall. The air smelled like coming rain. And as she looked up at the stars, clear and cold and endless, she whispered 2 words into the night: "Thank you." She didn't know exactly who she was speaking to. Maybe Michael. Maybe Samuel. Maybe the quiet force that had guided a tired man to her field that one cold night in autumn. But deep down, she knew some seeds take longer to bloom, and some mercies don't show their harvest until the sky opens above you and you realize you're standing in a field full of second chances. Spring arrived late in the mountains, but when it did, it came all at once. The fields behind Grace Dalton's farmhouse turned soft and green. Wildflowers pushed through gravel, like they had something to prove. And the bees, her girls, woke hungry and full of purpose. The barn doors stayed open most days now. Inside, laughter echoed through the rafters. The veterans called it the hive, not just because of the bees, but because something real buzzed inside it: connection, rhythm, healing, and grace. She moved with quiet steadiness through it all. She made strong coffee in the mornings. She showed new arrivals how to handle the hives without fear. And when someone couldn't sleep, she kept the porch light on. She'd long since stopped asking why this was happening, or how some gifts don't come with explanation. They just arrive. One Saturday in late April, a young man named Luis stood by the barn, a small wooden box in his hands. He was 28, Army 2 tours, and the kind of silence that came from seeing too much too fast. Grace saw him hesitate, then approach. "I made something," he said, voice rough with nerves, "for you." She opened the box. Inside was a carved honey dipper, hand-whittled. Smooth grip, tiny bee etched into the handle. Grace didn't speak. She ran her fingers over the detail. Luis looked down. "I didn't know what to say for months, but this place, it brought me back to myself." He glanced at her eyes, glassy. "Thank you." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to say anything, Luis, but I'll keep this forever." By June, the Dalton model had officially been replicated in 3 other states. Samuel spent more time traveling now, visiting sites, training teams, but he always returned to Ashe County, always called it home base. Grace never asked him to stay. She didn't have to. Every time he left a note on her kitchen table. "Back soon. Don't let the bees get soft on me." He always came back. The community around her began to change too. Folks who used to drive past with blank expressions now pulled into the gravel drive with pies, seedlings, old tools they thought might help. Local high school students came out on Saturdays to learn beekeeping. The hardware store started stocking special hive lumber and gave Grace a discount she never asked for. Even the bank. Yes, the same bank that nearly took her land sent her a letter offering to sponsor educational signage for the property. She didn't laugh. She just tucked the letter into a drawer with the others, the kind you don't forget, but don't let define you. That summer, Grace did something she hadn't done in years. She mailed postcards. One went to her cousin in Tennessee, letting her know the farm was still standing. One went to her late husband's old unit, care of a contact in Georgia, just a short line. Michael's bees are still flying. You'd be proud. And one folded into an envelope with no return address. Went to a name scrawled on a dog tag she'd kept since that first night. Samuel Dean. I see now that mercy, when given quietly, grows louder with time. You helped turn a broken barn into something holy. Wherever you go next, take that light with you. Grace, one crisp morning in early autumn as the leaves began their slow golden descent. Grace found Samuel on the porch swing with 2 mugs of coffee. She sat beside him. They rocked in silence for a while, listening to the bees in the distance, the birds stirring in the trees. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'm stepping back, he said, from the program. Not all of it, just the travel, the speeches, the spotlight. She looked at him, but didn't interrupt. I've seen what I needed to see. It's working. People are healing, and I've got what I need right here, Grace smiled gently. That a declaration, Sam? He chuckled, a low sound that felt like warmth. Maybe it is. Later that week, they held a harvest dinner on the lawn. Long wooden tables stretched under the string lights, honey-roasted carrots, smoked brisket, fresh bread, apples from Grace's trees. Veterans, neighbors, friends, everyone came. Grace stood to speak near the end, not one for public words, but knowing she owed them something. She held up the carved honey dipper from Luis. This isn't just a tool, she said. It's a reminder. She paused, her voice steady, full of soil and sorrow and strength. We keep little things, a dipper, a coin, a folded note. We keep them not for their shape, but for what they carry, for who they remind us we once were, or who we could still become. She looked out across the faces, some weathered, some young, all listening. This land almost broke. I almost let it, but someone knocked at my barn one night, and without knowing it, brought everything back to life. She held her glass high. To mercy, given without reason, the crowd echoed her, to mercy. That night, after the last plate was cleared and the fire pit burned low, Samuel placed something beside her on the porch table. It was a frame inside a photo, grainy black and white. A shot from months ago, her barn. 2 figures, one standing, one seated, lit only by the slant of morning light. Someone had labeled the bottom corner with a pen. The moment everything changed, Grace touched the glass. She didn't ask who took it. Didn't need to. Winter came again, but this time it wasn't unwelcome. The hives were strong, tucked beneath blankets of burlap and pine straw. The barn glowed softly each evening. And in the farmhouse, Grace kept the fire going, even on nights she didn't need it, just in case someone was passing through. One evening, as snow began to fall in soft spirals across the yard, Samuel handed her a new envelope. Inside, a land deed co-signed. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. She blinked at the signature, her name, his name. You bought it, she whispered. Not bought, he said. Invested in you in this. She touched the paper like it might disappear. Why? Samuel smiled. Because someone once gave me a night's rest and a bowl of soup, and it brought me back to life. She framed the deed beside the coin, right where the morning light could hit them. That spring, they started planting sunflowers behind the barn, rows of them, bright and stubborn. Bees loved them, so did people. The town started calling her place the Second Chance Farm. She never corrected them. Years from now, someone might drive down that same winding road through Ashe County. They might pass the fields, see the barn, the sign. They might hear the hum of bees in the warm wind and think it's always been that way. They won't know the whole story. How a woman once gave mercy without a question. How a man broken and wandering found healing in her silence. How kindness, quiet, ordinary kindness, landed helicopters in a field, rebuilt a barn, and kept a soul from falling apart. They won't know, but we do. Because kindness, when planted without expectation, never really dies. It roots down in forgotten places. It pushes up through cold earth. It waits patient and unseen until one day it blooms right in the heart of someone who needed it most. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way, often in the quietest places. Not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't going hungry. And sometimes That alone is enough to change a life. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.